Good evening. Buju Inanem, Julia Lafreniere and Indigenous, Camperville Gunji, Treaty 4, Nipaba, Joel Lafreniere, Indigenous, WAG-Qaumajuq. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Red River Metis Spirituality Beyond the Stereotypes with Dr. Chantal Fiola. My name is Julia Lafreniere. My family is from the Métis community of Camperville, Manitoba, located on Treaty 4 territory. I'm a member of the Stony Point Local of MMF, and I am the head of Indigenous initiatives at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, WAG-Qaumajuq. I'd like to acknowledge that the Winnipeg Art Gallery is located on the heartland and the homeland of the Red River Metis. It is also located on Treaty 1 territory. The Nahiawak and Anishinaabe were signatories to that treaty. And the WAG is also located on the unceded territory of the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Dene nations, which means they didn't enter into any treaty agreements with Canada. However, the territory is still their homeland. The WAG is home to many Inuit artworks, and the artworks in our collection are both on permanent and long-term loan from the government of Nunavut. And I take the role of the spiritual care of these artworks very seriously, as I recognize that the Inuit artworks are not on their homelands. And until they go back to their home, I care for them in the proper ceremonial way with feasting and prayers. There would not be an Inuit art center or Qaumajuq without these works, so I'm very grateful to them and to their makers. I begin by saying all these things because Canadians cannot continue to be ignorant to the reason we are able to live and exist on these lands today, which is due to the original caretakers, the Indigenous nations of the territory. And the reason the Winnipeg Art Gallery is able to exist is due to the Indigenous people that cared for these lands and waters for centuries. So I encourage everyone here to think about the ways we maintain the status quo in our lives and therefore perpetuate the systemic racism in Canada, and then to think of ways we can disrupt the status quo. Métis Kitchen Table Teachings is a virtual series dedicated to the transmission of Métis knowledge and culture. The virtual series is presented alongside the exhibition Heartbeat of a Nation, Métis Women 250 Years, by Métis artist Tracy Charette Fair. I'd like to thank the exhibition sponsors, the Manitoba Metis Federation and Infinity Women's Secretariat, for their support and ongoing engagement. So this is the last public event in the Métis Kitchen Table Teachings event series, and it has been my pleasure to highlight Métis voices through this programming. And the WAG is very grateful to all of the Métis folks involved for their partnership and the sharing of their knowledge. So this evening, we will have one question period at the end of the discussion, and I will be reading the questions from the chat box, so please write them there. And I will not be reading the questions until the end, so please keep that in mind. And we also might not have a chance to get to everyone's questions within the time frame, but we will do our best. So let me just spotlight Chantal's video here. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chantal Fiola. Chantal Fiola is Michif with family from St. Laurent and St. Geneviève, Manitoba. She's the author of Rekindling the Sacred Fire, Métis Ancestry and Anishinaabe Spirituality, which won her the John Hirsch Award for Most Promising Manitoba Writer and the Beatrice Monsignor Aboriginal Writer of the Year Award. Returning to Ceremony, Spirituality in Manitoba Métis Communities, released in the fall of 2021, is her follow-up book. Dr. Fiola was named Distinguished Indigenous Scholars Chair in 2021 by the University of Winnipeg. She is an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Intercity Studies at the University of Winnipeg, where she researches, publishes, and teaches in the areas of Métis and selected First Nations, identity, culture, spirituality, history, sexuality, sovereignty, and methodologies. Chantal is Two-Spirit, Midewiwin, a Sundancer, and lives with her wife and their daughter in Winnipeg. Over to you, Chantal.
Thank you much, Julia. So thank you very much to the WAG and to Julia for inviting me, for the land acknowledgement, for this fantastic series. Miigwech to the MMF and IWS for supporting it. I feel humbled to be part of it. Also a special miigwech to Julia, because not only was she a participant in the study that led to this book, but she also helped out as one of the community researchers, which we can talk about a little bit later. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Bojo Nindinoe Magni Doug, Zagate Kwe Indigenous, Bijune Dodem, Nin Nawe Nangweabe, Bejig Mede, Onimupakosamoin, Michifendao. I'm Michif, Red River Metis. Julia mentioned my mother's community is the historic Métis community of Ste Anne. My father comes from the French-Canadian community of Saint Geneviève, which is actually where I was raised. My grandmother is in that first photo on the left. She's second from the right, Dorothy Norman, née Guiboche. And right beside her is my late grandfather, Robert Normand. So I thought I would just share a little bit about how I came to the larger topic of Métis relationships with traditional Indigenous spirituality, because I wasn't raised with them. Actually, like many Red River Métis, I was raised Catholic. My family was very heavily involved in the church, but I ended up walking away as a young person. And it was through higher education that I found my way back to ceremonies. I did a PhD at Trent University. They've got a wonderful Indigenous studies program. I started meeting Midewiwin elders and traditional folks over there, and started going to ceremonies. So when I moved back home to Winnipeg, I started reaching out and looking for ceremonies and building relationships, not only with my mother's community, but also with different First Nations. There's a photo on the bottom left there. That's Charlie Nelson. He's chief of the Midewiwin Gun Lodge at Rosa River First Nation. He adopted me as a daughter several years ago. And I've been heavily involved in ceremonies ever since. There's a photo of me at Sundance. That was my second year. That's shared with permission from the Sundance chiefs, David and Cheryl Blacksmith. There's a lovely photo of my wife and I's Midewiwin, our traditional wedding ceremony, our super sweet little baby there in her Tikanagan. So ceremony has become an integral part of my life over the last 15 years. When I started going to ceremonies, I wondered, where are the other Métis folks? And I began this larger search of talking with folks, other Métis people, to find out if their family experiences were like mine. And so began my doctoral research, which led to the first book that you see on the screen here. In that one, I spent a lot of time unpacking why it seems like so many Métis have become disconnected from traditional Indigenous spirituality, ceremonies in particular, intergenerationally. And I spoke with 18 Métis people, mostly from Winnipeg, who go to ceremonies. So while that book focused on individuals, I see this book as part 2 in what I'm hoping will be a 3-part research journey. This one, I'm focusing on Métis communities, what's happening at the level of communities. One thing that I have been presented with time and time again is there are so many stereotypes about Métis people, about our identity, about our spirituality. I'm sure many of us here are familiar with lots of these. Of course, the thought that Métis equals mixed, or any mixture of Indigenous and non-Indigenous equals Métis, or that Métis people are somehow more mixed than other Indigenous people, or we're less authentic. Similarly, there are stereotypes about our spiritual practices. So probably the one that I've come up against most often is the belief that all Métis people are Christian. in particular Roman Catholic, at least in Manitoba, beliefs that we only go to church and that Métis people don't go to ceremonies, we don't use medicines, we don't sweat, etc. And through my research, I've found that that's just simply not true. None of these are true. So in searching for evidence of historic Métis participation in ceremonies, but also contemporarily, I've looked in oral history, in archives, in literature. I was fortunate in the summer of 2018 to spend time with esteemed elder Maria Campbell on her land near Batoche in Saskatchewan. And we talked a little bit about Métis relationships with ceremonies. And she shared with me, you know, that Métis people have been participating in ceremonies for as long as Métis people have existed. Her family doesn't seem to have had the disconnection that a lot of Métis families seem to have had in Manitoba. I'm curious about whether that's the case for other Métis folks in Saskatchewan. I'll talk about part 3 of my research later. There are definitely examples that can be found of our historic participation. So some people might be familiar with the Nehiyaw-Puat, the Iron Confederacy or the Iron Alliance. So this was an alliance in the early 1800s between Cree, Assiniboine, Saulteaux, and Métis. And as part of this trade and military and social alliance, Chief Meni Eagleset, an Assiniboine Cree leader, hosted a Sundance in what is now North Dakota, in the Turtle Mountains region, which of course borders into Manitoba. The purpose of the Sundance was to officially welcome the newcomers into the area, the Saulteaux or Anishinaabe, and the Michif, the Métis. And as part of that ceremony, well, that ceremony was gifted to the Anishinaabe and the Métis, along with a Unity of the People song. And then more recently in 2003, there was another ceremony on those lands, like commemorating this earlier ceremony, where that song was sung again. Another place that you can find evidence of our historic participation in ceremonies is the archives. So I've spent time there reading letters written by like early priests that came to Manitoba. So the first priests got here in 1818. And while they exaggerate the progress that they're making with their overall goal, which was to convert as many Indigenous folks as possible, you can occasionally find within those letters examples and evidence that while we did go to church, some Métis people also participated in specifically Midewiwin ceremonies, Sundance, and those kinds of things. There are excerpts from the letters in the book. In the interest of time, I want to make sure there's lots of time for discussion and questions, so I won't read an excerpt of that. There's also more contemporary literature. This is an understudied topic, but slowly there's really fascinating works coming about. In fact, the MMF has a book, the Métis Legacy 2 book, chapter 17 on that talks about Métis spirituality. And it says that, so this was written by the late Laurie Barkwell, Darren Prefontaine, and Anne-Marie Acot. And they say that like basically too much attention has been paid to Métis relationships with Catholicism to the detriment of Métis relationships with traditional Indigenous spirituality. And that is indeed part of our spirituality and is deserving of attention. Flaminio, Godet, and Dorian have a really cool new article called Métis Women Gathering, Visiting Together and Voicing Wellness for Ourselves, which I'm really excited about. They essentially spoke with a group of Métis women in Saskatchewan who participated in ceremonies as part of this research study. So I would encourage folks to check that out if they're interested. So in terms of framing the research study, of course, I wanted to also speak with contemporary Métis people who go to ceremonies. So I was fortunate to get some SSHRC funding, and I hired a team of 6 Métis community researchers and highlighted 6 historic Métis communities in Manitoba. They appear in bold on the screen there: Duck Bay, Camperville, Ste Anne, St. François-Xavier, Lorette, and Ste Anne. And so the 6 community researchers I hired were folks that were already connected to one or more of these communities. And we spoke with 32 Red River Métis people who go to ceremonies and are connected to at least one of these 6 communities. So they shared some of their family experiences with or relationships with Métis culture, First Nations cultures, settler cultures, identity, relationship to land. They also shared personal stories about their own identity and their own spiritual journey. So these are some of the themes that emerged. In terms of Métis family relationships with Métis communities, multiple generations of Métis families have a connection to like any given particular Métis community, but also they have connections to multiple Métis communities, like an extensive list of Métis communities. And the reason for that in part is, of course, our historically like semi-nomadic nature, but also because of the legacy of colonization. There are stories about, you know, Métis people getting kicked out of their communities when a municipality takes it over, and therefore having connections to multiple communities. Unsurprisingly, everyone except for one person described a strong family relationship with Catholicism. This is an excerpt from Louis, who is connected to Ste Anne, to give you a sense of what this relationship looked like. Louis shared, "The way to rise above poverty, to rise above the discrimination, is to show how devout you were as Catholics. That was your Métishood. That was who you were. It had to do with being a choir boy. It had to do with being altar boys from a young age. It had to do with showing up for church and having 12 people from your family fill up 2 pews, and then you were proud. If you weren't Catholic, you could not elevate yourself. You could not find work, and there was going to be no hope out of your poverty and misery." So while certainly some Métis families wanted a priest in their community, as I mentioned, historically, we also participated in ceremonies, but because of increasing pressures of assimilation, it became more and more difficult to have a relationship with ceremonies, and adherence to Catholicism became like a survival mechanism as our people dealt more and more with racism and pressures to assimilate. Some of the people we spoke with also talked about traditional Indigenous spirituality in their family or their communities while they were growing up. So here's an excerpt from people from Camperville and Duck Bay. Louise explained, "I got a really big book about land surrendered here in Métis land script called Pine Creek First Nation and Duck Bay Surrender. That's part of our community and what happened. It also goes into great length about Camperville and practicing the Midewiwin ceremonies and Sundance ceremonies historically." George in neighboring Duck Bay said something similar. George shared, "There were ceremonies held in my community. The shake tent was brought there by the elders. There's a certain part there, if you drive across the lake. They used to hold ceremonies there. In the 1800s, all the tribes from around there went and had a gathering in September or August for 2 weeks. They brought the shake tents there twice because 2 twin brothers drowned and they wanted elders to help them, wise men to find where the bodies went down, where they'd be. That was in the 1950s. Interestingly, most of the folks we spoke with talked about their families, like a decrease in their attendance at church and an increase in their families' curiosity about and sometimes participation in ceremonies. The participants themselves shared generously about their own personal journeys with spirituality, and participate in many different kinds of ceremonies, like 2 to 16 distinct types of ceremonies, especially sweat lodge, Sundance, smudging, medicines, pipe, spirit name, and fasting. They also shared disconnection factors that have inhibited their reconnection to ceremony, as well as connection factors that have nurtured their relationship with ceremonies. And then there are also community-specific themes that emerged. So, for example, Ste Anne, Lorette, and St. François-Xavier, the non-Indigenous population now outnumbers the Indigenous population. And so we see consequences of that, including higher rates of mobility. So people from these communities shared connections with a greater number of distinct Métis communities. They were less likely to be aware of historic family connections to ceremonies, which doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have any. It just means that they may have become disconnected from the stories within their own family, as is the case for many of us. And they are more likely to report self-doubt and internalizing stereotypes about Métis identity and spirituality. So on the flip side, Duck Bay, Camperville, and Ste Anne, the Indigenous population still outnumbers the non-Indigenous population in those communities. So we see greater intergenerational residence patterns, multiple generations living in a single community, and also the least variation in identity. So while most of the people in the study call themselves Métis or Michif, some folks also identify with other markers, but that was less likely to be shared by the people in communities where the Indigenous population was still dominant. It seems like, at least for the folks that we spoke with, lots of them are having to leave their Métis community in order to go to ceremonies. Sometimes a great distance, like all the way to Alberta, depending on where they find a spiritual home, a spiritual community. However, we also found that increasingly ceremony is becoming accessible within some of these Métis communities. And we see evidence of this when the participants share, for example, that they have like built a sweat lodge in their yard, for example. An exciting example is the Sundance has returned to Duck Bay just a few years ago. Other folks talked about hosting fasting camps on their property. So here's an excerpt from Charlotte, who's also connected to Ste Anne. She shared, "It was funny because I told everybody I'm going to be putting up red prayer flags at the 4 corners, the directions to come to our place. So they all found the place easily. There were about 300 people that showed up. After the fast ended, I went to take down the flags to burn them in a sacred fire, but they were all gone. So I thought, because I put them up at the road signs, I wondered if the municipality picked them up. So I went to the municipality and said, did you guys pick up 4 red flags at 4 different intersections? He said, yeah, one of your neighbors came and told us there was going to be an Indian uprising, all these native people heading to your place. And I burst out laughing. I says, oh my God, next time you talk to him, tell him to come over for tea and ask me about it. If he would have had tea in Bannock with us, we would have helped him understand what this was about. And they all chuckled after that, gave me the flags, and I brought them home. But you see, people fear things because they don't understand them. So this gives a sense of some of the barriers that folks are having to overcome, some of the ignorance that still exists around ceremonies and Métis people participating in them. Sometimes that ignorance is found within our own families because of the legacy of colonization. I want to share one final excerpt here. This is from Gripet, who lives in Ste Laurent, and it's a story about the day that she built a sweat lodge in her yard. When we built the sweat lodge in my yard, the priest came. Father Michel was Métis. He would talk to me about spirituality and ceremony. He'd have sage in the house where he lived. I went and cleaned the sage for him one time, and I did some teachings about sage. He always said he wanted to know more, and he wanted to participate in ceremonies. So on the day that we were building the lodge, I invited him. He came and dropped by with his holy water, and he was doing his holy water on the sweat lodge. She starts to chuckle, and on the ground. I asked her, when the priest came and blessed your sweat lodge with holy water, was he doing it in a friendly and encouraging way? She said, oh yeah. I said, okay, because I have heard other stories of them doing it in like a remove the devil kind of way, but I didn't get that feeling from your story. She said, it was neat because that same summer we did that, there was a woman that came to the lodge. She's very Catholic, and she felt really good being there in the sweat lodge because Father Michel blessed it with holy water. So she felt like it was okay. I really like that story because it shows some of the healing that can take place. And sometimes there's divisions between people that identify as like staunchly Catholic and folks that have found their way back to ceremonies, or families that have maintained a connection with ceremonies all along. So I'll just end here by sharing some of my hopes and my goals for doing work like this. I'm really hoping to debunk some of those stereotypes that I started off tonight by talking about. I'm hoping to create space for more Métis people to find their way back to ceremonies if they feel called to do that. I would love to help heal some of the relationships between Métis and First Nation peoples that are a result of colonization. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. And instead of that stereotype that all Métis people are Christian or Catholic, I hope folks begin to understand Métis spirituality as existing on a continuum with Christianity on one end, especially Roman Catholicism, and traditional Indigenous spirituality on the other, and an infinite blend of, a beautiful blend of both all along the center, and that folks recognize or remember that ceremonies are a legitimate part of Métis spirituality in its own right. And that this is not a new thing, that historically some Métis people went to church and went to ceremonies, and that that's increasingly true for an ever greater number of us today. I think I'll end there. Stop sharing.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So I have a few questions. You mentioned that in 1818, there are some letters by early priests that talked about the Métis community and I guess ceremony. And maybe can you elaborate on what those letters said?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I found evidence of Métis participation in ceremonies in letters by Fathers Georges-Antoine Bellecour, Bishop Joseph Norbert Provencher, Charles Camper, and Laurent Simonet. So let's see, I'll give an example here. So in a letter written by Father Camper while stationed in St. Laurent to Archbishop Taché in 1868, we read of a large gathering of Indigenous people that he had hoped were there for like Catholic instruction, but were there in fact for Indigenous ceremony in the region of Duck Bay, which is one of the communities in the study. So these are all in French, so I've translated them. So he wrote, the majority of the Indigenous Catholics in Duck Bay had already arrived. There were also many savages. There's some pretty terrible terminology in here, but by that he means like non-Christian Indigenous folks who had arrived. These ones had come from Beaver River. For what purpose had all these Christians and non-Christian Indigenous people gathered? Was it to be instructed in the teachings of the Catholic religion? This was the least of their concerns. Their principal goal for converging on the salt springs, I believe, was to participate in La Grande Médecine, which is how they called the Midewiwin Lodge. They beat their drums day and night. The evening before they departed, a grand lodge was dressed. The complex ceremony unfolded. Every savage had their face painted with ochre. They were all very proud. These poor savages are really to be pitied. When we speak to them about Catholicism, they appear to listen, they appear to agree with all this instruction, and yet they do not, excuse me, they do not make the slightest effort to abandon their savagery. So, and of the population in the region of Duck Bay is Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree. I'll share one more example here that highlights Métis in particular. So this was a letter by Father Simonet written in 1866, and he's congratulating himself on converting Métis, a traditional Métis spiritual leader. So he was traveling on the west side of Lake Manitoba, again to Duck Bay, in the company of a Métis guide named Pierre Chartrand, when they encountered a Métis spiritual leader on his deathbed. So he writes, "The sick person was an old Métis elder, but one who had lived his life as a veritable savage, believing and practicing all the superstitions of savages. He has always been recognized as a powerful ceremony maker. He had not seen a priest since the priest left the Manitoba post. He did not even know how to make the sign of the cross. Despite always having said he wanted to die the way he lived, in savagery, so according to traditional Indigenous spirituality, he appeared happy to see me. With a few words, I taught him some of the principal truths of our religion. He appeared touched when he learned that the good Lord was ready to pardon all his sins in front of the whole world, so in front of Father Simonet and his Métis guide. He renounced his Indigenous spirituality out of joy at having just heard the truth about Catholicism, and after his confession, I performed his last rites." So you can see here there's an example, just one example of a recognized, respected Métis traditional spiritual leader who all his life resisted converting to Catholicism and then did so only on his deathbed, where I'm sure it sounds really appealing to hear that you'll be taken care of in the ever after if you renounce your spirituality and adopt this one. So, I mean, you know, getting us at our most vulnerable. So yeah, but I mean, these are just some examples, right? So there's certainly evidence that some of us participated historically. And there are some families that never lost the connection, like I mentioned, Maria Campbell's family. So actually, I also mentioned that part 3 of this, I'm hoping to branch out into like the larger Metis Nation, like specifically the 3 prairie provinces. So I'm hoping to speak with Métis people that go to ceremonies in at least one historic Métis community in each of the 3 prairie provinces. So it'll be interesting to see if there are similarities or, oh, you know, one other thing that Maria Campbell shared was that Métis connection to ceremonies has been and continues to be stronger in those Métis communities that don't have a dominant hold by Catholicism, which of course makes sense. So it would be interesting to speak with folks from communities like that as well. Yeah.
I also noticed that the communities that have more of like a non-Indigenous population, they're also like closer to Winnipeg and closer to urban centers, which might contribute to the population numbers too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, I worked with a cartographer. I'm so excited about that map, but you can see, you know, the proximity to like First Nation reserves or other like non-Indigenous rural communities or urban locations. And that definitely seems to have an impact on people's relationship with spirituality.
What I love the most about your research is that it emphasizes and highlights the fact that Christianity and Indigenous traditions can coexist together. Whereas if you look at it from like the Christian perspective, they wanted to make us Christian because the alternative was savagery. And so the fact that they can actually coexist together, and of course that's coming from me too, someone that was raised in the Catholic Church, where I sort of grew up thinking that way. But it's so interesting to learn that historically they did coexist, and that our ancestors didn't embrace this. No, it's not a like dichotomy. It's not one or the other. Both can exist.
Yeah, it seems like such a shame to be fear-based. I mean, one of the first things that I learned when I started going to ceremonies was, you know, like teachings around respect, and that we don't pressure people to come to ceremonies. You don't force people to come to ceremonies. Instead, it's like by attraction. So if people feel called, or if they're curious and they want to come, we're not supposed to turn people away, which seems like almost an opposite approach to, you know, like a missionary missionizing approach. Of course, there are different denominations, and some denominations seem maybe more open to like syncretic blends. So some of the, at least a couple of the folks that we spoke with talked about like the Native American church, and that they felt really comfortable and at home there because it wouldn't be uncommon for the clergy to speak an Indigenous language, or for there to be songs, music and dance coming from Indigenous cultures, also use of medicines and smudging happening in church. So exciting examples of syncretism that blend.
My dad talks about a priest in Camperville that learned Soto. And I don't know if he gave mass in Soto, but he would visit with the community in Soto. But it's interesting, like I doubt he did that to, you know, be a part of the community as much as he did it to maybe invite people to come into the church to make it seem like a safe place, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, people's motivations. I mean, good question. I have heard other exciting stories about like really open-minded priests. So I don't know his name, but I don't know if he's still working there, but there was a priest that worked in Hollow Water First Nation for like many years, like a beloved member of the community, had great relationships. And he was so involved in the ceremonies that the community had. Like I was in a sweat lodge with this priest, and he had like a cross on his neck, and I was like, what's happening here, you know? But like such a friendly guy, and such a great example of the respect that we can have.
I love that.
Yeah.
I have one more question, and then we can go to the chat because there's a few questions there already. So the range in ages of the participants in your research, I know was probably young to old. I'm wondering if there was any themes towards maybe some of the older folks that had maybe grown up staunchly Catholic, or their parents were Catholic, because I know in my family, my grandmother was very, very, very proud to be Catholic. And so I'm wondering if the older people, if you noticed any themes when talking to them.
So the age range was from, I believe, 18 to 83. And, you know, something that actually arose across both of the books in terms of like an age pattern was people in the older generations often spoke about like the Red Power movement, the sovereignty movement, like American Indian movement, and having chapters in Canada, as doing so much to create space and give permission for Indigenous folks to be proud to be Indigenous again. And that was like a catalyst in their journey, reconnecting with their culture and with ceremonies. And then for younger folks, they talked about higher education. So, and like I did at the beginning too. So it seems kind of ironic because, you know, one of the disconnection factors that people raised was like day and residential schools as kind of severing our relationship with ceremonies. But then contemporarily, people are talking about gaining access to their culture through higher education. So like I mentioned, the Indigenous Studies PhD program, and other folks mentioned other university programs where they had elders who were doing like traditional teachings. Sometimes they even talked about like a sweat lodge being built on campus. And for many of them, it was the first time that they had access to that. And that was like a major catalyst for them reconnecting. It was very, very interesting.
So there's a really good question here in the chat. There's a few of them actually, so maybe I'll read one of them. Can Chantal describe the Métis First Nations relationship difficulty she mentioned? How is this manifest, and are there specific communities that are affected?
Great question. Okay, so throughout the history of colonization, there have been many tools of colonization with the overall goal of assimilation. So, like I mentioned, residential schools, the 60s scoop, the Indian Act, and the creation of like a hierarchy of status. All of these things have harmed the kinship relationships that exist between Métis people and our First Nation relatives. The government has dealt with Métis people differently than First Nations people. Again, always with an eye towards assimilation. But after generations of being told in your day school or through your foster home or your adopted home, or by the government in any number of ways, that Métis is completely different from First Nations, you start to internalize this. I like mentioning that we were forced to exist in this rights-based agenda. So for Métis people to access Section 35 rights, we have to prove that we are wholly distinct from First Nations. And that puts some of us in a very difficult position because some people have a First Nation parent and a Red River Métis parent. But like the MMF, band councils, the federal government, all of these levels of government tell us that we can't be both. You can even get kicked out of one if they find out that you've been accepted in another. Now, it wasn't like that historically, obviously. There was more of like an emphasis on interconnection and relationships and kinship obligations. So one of the ways, like I argue that has also impacted our like Métis relationships with spirituality, because that is seen as something like distinctly First Nation. And because so many Métis families have become disconnected from our own relationship with ceremonies. Another like something irrefutable that hopefully gets through to folks is like Gabriel Dumont, one of the most famous Métis people of all time, had a really strong relationship with traditional ceremonies. Like his dad put him out on a vision quest before puberty, and he had a vision that gained him the ability to call bison, and he was like a renowned bison hunter. He also gained the ability of doctoring. He was familiar with traditional medicines like tobacco, sweetgrass. There's a story that I came across where he had braided sweetgrass into the shape of a cross and carried that with him everywhere. I read a story about him smudging Riel's grave and the mourners that gathered. He was a firekeeper for a sweat lodge. He built sweat lodges. He sweat in them. He attended Sundances, like all of these fantastic examples. And then of course he helped build that church. So another wonderful example of this syncretism that I keep talking about. But I think lots of Métis people don't know this. Like, we've become disconnected from these stories. And so we've internalized, and sometimes our elders and our leadership have sometimes internalized this harmful view that all Métis people are Catholic or Christian. And it's just simply not true. And it never was.
Another question in the chat. How does Dr. Fiola's research understand the difference between Métis peoples and families reconnecting to Indigenous spirituality and cultural practice versus people who claim Métis ancestry who want to be part of traditional Métis ceremonies?
Also a great question. First of all, okay, so we're talking about this phenomenon of race shifting. In this book, unlike in the first one, I tried to take extra steps to help curb race shifting. So for example, not only is it grounded in these 6 recognized historic Métis communities in Manitoba, but also in order to participate in the study, participants had to meet the Métis National Council definition for Métis. So identify as Métis, be able to prove a connection to a historic Métis community, a recognized historic Métis community, contemporary acceptance by the Métis community in the form of like an MMF card, for example, or a script. You don't have to have an MMF card. You can have photocopies of script in your family. And then the 4th criteria is being wholly distinct from First Nations. I already talked about how I feel like that's kind of a sticky situation. Of course, we are distinct Indigenous nations and we all want to retain our sovereignty, but that shouldn't overshadow the fact that we're also relatives. Okay, race shifting. Unfortunately, like this seems to be such a growing problem. There's news articles every day about these like really prominent people that we thought were Métis, and people are investigating them and their identity has shifted like really drastically to completely different nations over time, while they have climbed the ladder and become hugely successful and powerful decision makers and gatekeepers for our nation, speaking for Métis people. Similar things are happening with First Nation communities too, unfortunately. But yeah, so I mean, those were some of the concrete steps that I was able to take and make sure that I took like a clear stance in this book against race shifting. When it comes to participation in actual ceremonies, though, that's probably a trickier topic because like I mentioned, you know, we're like one of the teachings is you're not really supposed to turn people away. So that looks differently in different spiritual communities. Like some communities are very, like spiritual communities are very insular. And so there's like essentially rules for who can be there and who can participate, and they don't advertise, and it's not really like and anyone can come. But then there are other places that have like an open door policy and everybody's welcome, and you know, they're not checking MMF cards, for example, at the door.
Well, I think for your research, it's really important that like you took those steps to ensure that you're talking to the historical Red River people that have connection to that community. So another question in the chat. I am Red River Métis and work on a Cree reserve. I am trying to reconnect with my culture and spirituality, but feel very uncomfortable because there's a lot of lateral violence. Any advice on how I can access these ceremonies?
So this could just take a lot of patience and time, because like if it's not your community, then, you know, it just takes sensitivity and relationship building. Like essentially, you need to foster those relationships with some folks in the community. Like if you're trying to access like Cree ceremonies in this Cree community, then, you know, building relationships, I think, would be the way to go. And then they'll bring you, you know, that's always kind of the advice. Like if people ask me, like, how do I find ceremonies? Like, I don't know where to go. I don't know how to start. You know, ideally, it's the relationships that you build and people will bring you with them. Like that's what happened to me. I mentioned I started meeting these like Midewiwin elders who eventually brought me with them. And then I did eventually start meeting like Métis people who also go to ceremonies. But yeah, it just takes some time. You know, I mean, I don't want to overstep, but like you could also make use of, I don't know if you're familiar with medicines, but you can also like use some of the traditional medicines to petition for these, you know, things that you're trying to find or people or whatnot that you want to come into your life. But yeah, it's about relationships and it takes time.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say I would recommend having tea with maybe some of the Cree elders in the community, and you know, not necessarily talking about ceremony and everything right away, but just sharing space with them and getting to know them and get to know the community in that way. Another question. I'm just learning about my Métis history and noticed that so many of the persons involved today in the promotion of Métis culture, research, education, even politics seem to be women. Do you find that women drive the spirituality resurgence as well?
Interesting. You know, there's kind of like a running joke, at least in the spiritual communities that I've been blessed to become part of, where people joke about like, where are the men? Because there's often like way more women at ceremonies, you know, like in a sweat, like the women are like squished like sardines and there's like so much space on the men's side. And it's not just in sweat, there's like other kinds of ceremonies as well. And I wonder why that is. You know, however, it's still often the case that men are the leaders in these spiritual communities. And I think that has to do with like internalizing patriarchal ideals that have been brought by Europeans and internalized in our communities. So it's refreshing when you find a community that, for example, like a husband and wife are like the leaders. And then, you know, there are some very strong like female spiritual leaders as well. May Louise Campbell and the, what is it called? Their Women's Healing Village. They just got some land and they're starting like they're building buildings over there and doing like such wonderful work. So that's a really exciting, cool example. Those are just some thoughts that come to mind about that great question.
Another question. I was brought up very strictly Catholic, but I feel a pull to Indigenous teaching and ceremony. I am in the first generation of my family in roughly 5 generations to connect with Métis heritage, as it was a taboo topic. I have felt that I am not deserving to take part in ceremony, if that makes sense. Do you have any advice for people that feel like that? Because I know it's probably quite common.
You know, it was a very common. In fact, I'll share an excerpt. This is how common it is. So like if you think about the history, the collective history of the Metis Nation and how, you know, Métis people were kicked out of the province of Manitoba after we confederated, or after we, confederated the province. The Red River Expeditionary Forces that came and like were like beating us and killing us and raping our women, like this horrible legacy, and you know, trying to build a new like homeland in places like Batoche, in Saskatchewan, and for it to happen all over again. And then, you know, after the Northwest Resistance in 1885, where, you know, English Canada hated us and we were called rebels and traitors, like, of course, it's not surprising that some Métis people and families chose to hide their indigeneity, like as a survival mechanism. And so after generations of doing this, it's not uncommon. In fact, it seems like a common internalized belief for Métis people to feel like what this person is describing. So here's an excerpt that Andrea shared. She's connected to Lorette. I want to go to ceremonies more, but again, it's all those thoughts in my head like, you're not Indigenous enough, you're not Métis enough. People are going to be like, tell me about this and that. And I'm going to be like this past Sunday, I thought, I can't go by myself to that sweat lodge. People are going to be like, who are you? And I'm going to be like, I know nothing. I talk myself out of it. I want that crutch, like my sister or you or somebody there, so I don't feel so alone. It's that working myself up where I'm like, I have so many questions. What questions am I going to ask that are stupid? So like, this is, you know, way too common of a thing. And, you know, it's like those stereotypes that I talked about at the beginning are so prevalent and they're so stubborn and we've internalized them. So, I mean, yeah, it's not surprising that people feel that way. So just know that you're not alone, and hopefully you take solace and comfort in knowing that some of your Métis ancestors participated in ceremonies. Like, it's not a debate, it's a fact. And there's lots of examples in the book. And then just, you can talk to living, breathing Métis people, and more of us are finding our way back. So hopefully we can heal relationships with like Catholic Métis folks and find guidance from Métis people who do both, who go to church and ceremonies and feel good and comfortable and confident in doing so, as they should. Don't give up.
Yeah, and I think that's why you feel like the pull, because it's in our ancestral blood. Our families did it, and that's why you're feeling that. So don't feel ashamed to come around or shy. And yeah, I think that's a great way to end it. Thanks very much, Chantal. I put a link to your book in the chat there for everyone. And if you know anyone that would be interested in this conversation, it's going to be on YouTube. There's a link in the chat to the past Métis Kitchen Table teachings videos. And thanks to the MMF and the Infinity Women's Secretariat for supporting this project. And again, thank you, Chantal, for taking time this evening and sharing your knowledge with us. Miigwech.
Miigwech to you. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the wonderful work that you've put into this fantastic series. I'm glad that it exists in the internet and that we can keep watching it. So, and thanks to everybody for joining tonight.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, folks.